So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity tonight. So the title of my talk, Taming the Tsetse fly. And as Liesel said, I'm currently with the Agricultural Research Council Onderstepoort Veterinary Research Institute in Pretoria. But I also want to acknowledge the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, which is where most of the talk I'm going to present tonight, much of the work comes from the time I spent with them. Okay, so just a basic overview. I'm going to give you a little bit of background of the disease, the distribution of the disease, the vector, the parasites, and the impact that it has in Africa, and then talk about the two diseases that are transmitted by tsetse flies, human African trypanosomosis or sleeping sickness, and animal African trypanosomosis or Nagana. Then I'm going to talk about control of the disease, and specifically research and development that we conducted in these past years. And then a little bit touch on the interesting and unique situation for South Africa, where we've got the issue, or where we've got the interesting duality between control and conservation. Okay, so tsetse flies, what are they and where are they? So tsetse flies are obligatory blood feeders, and they occur only in Africa, in 38 Sub-Saharan African countries. So if you look at the map, it's quite clear that really it's the tropics and the subtropics where we are. So the Sahel and the Sahara is just too dry, so we don't find them there. Similarly, down south in Namibia, Kalahari, it's too dry. And then in South Africa, we only have them in the northeastern corner of South Africa, which is basically above the cold degree line, where it becomes too cold in winter, so the pupa can't survive. I'll touch on that a little bit later. Okay, so trypanosome parasites, which are actually the disease-causing organisms, occur naturally in wild animals. So we could almost say that the tsetse fly, in fact, is innocent. It just wants a blood meal, but then it transmits the parasites, which actually cause the diseases. And then blood feeding by an infected tsetse fly transmit the disease of the parasites between animals and humans. Okay, so the background of a disease. So very long ago, African trypanosomes, the parasites, evolved as gut parasites, or gut parasite organisms in insects. And then about 35 million years ago, tsetse flies evolved and started to serve as a vector for these gut organisms, which then became adapted to the blood invertebrate hosts. It's important to note that the parasites only occur in vertebrate hosts, which is basically a warm-blooded or a medium-blooded, medium-temperature animal, because we also find them in reptiles. In wild animals, because of their long evolution with the parasites and tsetse flies, developed a tolerance against the disease. And most wild animals in the tsetse area will have trypanosomes. So just for an example here, the time I spent in KwaZulu-Natal, when I started my work on tsetse flies, there was an incident where white rhinos were moved from, I think, a park in the Free State was moved into KwaZulu-Natal Park. And within a few months, both these rhinos picked up Nagana, and I'm not sure if they died, but they were certainly diagnosed with Nagana, just to show the what do you call it, naivety or susceptibility of animals which are not exposed to the tsetse flies and the parasites. Then domestic animals, especially cattle, is fairly recent in Africa, about 13,000 years, and they are yet to develop full tolerance or resistance against trypanosomes. There are a few breeds of cattle which are semi-tolerant, semi-resistant against trypanosomes, mainly in West Africa. But this is only a temporary or a semi-tolerance, because in times of hardship, for example, drought, when these animals also suffer quite severely from the disease. In human African trypanosomosis, there's only 2 species of a parasite which affects the humans. Again, this is also a fairly recent evolutionary development with these 2 species, which is Trypanosoma pusei-rhodesiense and Trypanosoma gambiense, which affect humans. Okay, so a little bit on the vector, tsetse flies themselves. As I mentioned, where both male and female are obligatory blood feeders. In nature, we have an average lifespan of 1 to 3 months, so fairly short actually. And what's interesting about them is that the females mate only once, and then the sperm are stored in spermatheca, and then with every ovarian development, enough sperm is released for fertilization. The larvae develop inside the female uterus until the final instar, and this is quite unique in the insect kingdom because it's almost mammal-like with a very high degree of parental protection given for the larvae. And the larvae, as you can see on these pictures, that white larvae, the young larvae, is very full of fat, which is actually a type of milk gland which the female have, which nourish the larvae and gives it enough food or nourishment to survive. Once the larvae or the pupa is deposited, it digs in with a wriggly action. It digs into the soil about 3 to 10 centimeters below the surface, and it takes about 30 days development depending on temperature, and then the adult fly emerge. However, due to this slow reproduction cycle, female tsetse fly really only can produce about 5 to 8 individual offspring in a lifetime. So if you compare this to a mosquito, which lays about 300 eggs at a time, several times. So the tsetse fly really is a unique species in the insect kingdom. Tsetse flies are also the only cyclical vector of trypanosomosis, both animal and human diseases. This means that the parasite develops fully between the tsetse fly and the mammalian host, and there's no third intermediary host in between. Although, having said that, other biting flies can also transmit trypanosomes mechanically. So, for example, the bunny-day horseflies or the stable flies. And this is mainly because of, especially the bunny-day, because of their large mouth parts. So, if they are in a herd of cattle or a herd of buffalo, and the fly takes an infected blood feed from one animal and moves rapidly to another, there is a potential that the parasites might survive on its mouth parts and be introduced into the next animal. Okay, so with this disease distribution, the disease really is limited by the tsetse fly distribution. The affected area of Africa is about 9 million square kilometers, really from Senegal in the north to South Africa in the south. And you can see here on the table, there's 3 groups of tsetse flies, total about 28 species. But not all tsetse flies are responsible for disease transmission. It really depends on the trypanosome parasite species, of which there's about 20 species. And if you look on the maps on the right-hand side, you can see the top one is the Palpalis or the riverine group, really in the tropics, West Africa and Central Africa. Then the Fusca or forest group, similar sort of distribution, a little bit smaller. And then the savanna fly, which occurs right down to Southern Africa. Okay, so a little bit about the disease. So human African trypanosomosis, HAT, or sleeping sickness. So there are 2 forms of the disease. First is the Gambiense form or the chronic form. So this is a form which is mainly in, excuse me, in West and Central Africa. And this, if you are bitten with this, infected with this from an infected tsetse fly, you can live with it for quite some time. Death occurs in 2 to 3 years if you don't get treatment. So that's why it's a chronic form. And if you can see on the map here, everything west and north of that black line basically is the Gambiense form. Then in the southern and eastern part, you have a Rhodesiense form, which is an acute form, which acts quite fast, and without treatment, death is within 3 to 6 months. Currently, WHO, the World Health Organization, estimates 15,000 to 15,000 cases per year, and they are fatal if untreated. And having said that, it is still considered as a neglected tropical disease. Again, if you think about malaria, where there's something like 3 million cases per year, it doesn't sound as serious, but the reason for it being called a neglected tropical disease is because there is actually technology and knowledge available to treat it. It's more a lack of political and financial willpower. Okay, just a little bit of history on the Gambiense sleeping sickness. Historically, incidence of sleeping sickness has decreased quite a bit. And if you look at this graph, you can see it corresponds from mid-1940s, so basically after the Second World War, when chemicals became available for insecticide, for insect control. There was huge efforts which really made a big impact on the disease prevalence. And then if you look at the graph, you can see from 60s, 70s, 1980s, it started to pick up again. And this coincides with the independence of much of the African countries, when the independence and then the subsequent political unrest and political instability that happened. So much of the previous efforts either got completely stopped or just wasn't strong enough to continue. And then here you can see in early 2000s, late 1990s, there was some serious outbreaks, and then again a decline towards where we are now. Okay, so sleeping sickness. Symptoms. So there are two stages in human sleeping sickness. First or early stage, hemolymphatic stage, which is where the trypanosomes are restricted to the blood and the lymph system. So typical symptoms is fever, headaches, joint pain, and the diagnosis is with a blood examination, either through microscope or by rapid field test. However, this generally goes undetected unless there's an active screening program. So an active screening program means that we go out, we mobilize the community, everyone or many as possible people come and they all get a blood screen or through blood examination, through microscope or a rapid field test. And the reason it goes undetected is because the symptoms are quite similar to malaria. So people don't necessarily realize they have sleeping sickness. Then the second or late stage is the neurological stage, and this is where the parasites now enter into the cerebrospinal fluid and eventually into the brain. So the typical signs is extreme lethargy, disturbed sleep patterns, confusion, sensory disturbance, no appetite, so emaciation, coma, and eventually death. And this is where the term sleeping sickness comes from. It's not that you actually sleep, it's just that you are so tired and so little energy that you cannot do much. So you are not much used to your family anymore. And this has a huge socio-economic impact in the subsistence farming areas in Africa. So the diagnosis for the second stage is a very nasty diagnosis. It's through a lumbar puncture. So we physically have to take out some cerebrospinal fluid and examine that. So it's really not a nice thing. And many patients prefer not to go for treatment because they know they've got sleeping sickness and they don't want to go through the pain. There is a new development, which is a rapid field test. So if you look on this top photograph, you can see that little device on the table there with those rings. It's an agglutination test, which is within 20 minutes, you have a patient's positive or negative, you have a result. The benefit of this is it can be stored at ambient temperature, it's cheap and it's rapid. Okay, so who are most exposed and why, where? So sleeping sickness really is a disease of poorer areas, poorer countries, and of remote areas where it's difficult for medical teams to come in, difficult for control operations to be done. So women and children are unfortunately the most exposed and the most at risk. And the reason is that in many of these rural communities, people are still completely reliant on the river systems for their water usage, for washing and cook water for food and so on. And of course, it's the women who go down to the river to collect the water, and the children accompany them. So this is where they get exposed. Okay, how do we control the human sleeping sickness? So we've got basically two options. The first is medical intervention, which is this bottom photograph. You can see this is a mass screening program that's going on there. But however, this only addresses the symptoms. So it only shows people are affected or not. And you can treat them, but as long as the vector population still survive, you still have a problem. So the second option then is vector control, which is the only real long-term solution. Basically, if there is no tsetse flies, there can be no disease because the parasite has no other vector to transmit it. So the aim is to reduce the tsetse populations to below the effective transmission level. Okay, if we look at animal disease, animal African trypanosomosis, it is also called Nagana, which is the Zulu word for powerless or listless. It's basically similar symptoms: fever, listlessness, emaciation, anemia, which then results in abortion and death. The treatment, there are several treatments, what do you call it? Chemical treatments available, both preventative and prophylactic, which is available from veterinary shops. The impact of Nagana is that it severely limits agricultural development. The animals are too weak to work, for example, as draft animals, and they're also in too poor condition to sell. So for a subsistence farmer, this has serious implications. In Africa, it's estimated that about $4 billion per year is lost due to weak animals or the effect of Nagana on cattle especially. And as I said, it affects 38 of the 54 countries in Africa. This leads to the situation what we call Africa's green desert, which is basically the tropics and those areas which are unable to be utilized for agriculture due to the presence of tsetse flies and trypanosomes. So the potential for tsetse in Africa is estimated at 140 million cattle, but currently Africa only has about 20 million cattle. So this sounds terrible if you're a cattle farmer, but it sounds very good if you're a conservationist. Okay, so how do we actually control the flies? So from 1900 to 1940s, it was really quite a destructive method of control, mainly through habitat destruction. The idea was that if you remove a vegetation, you create a barrier which the flies can't cross. And this is because tsetse flies are very susceptible to dehydration. It really needs shady areas. So it can move short periods through a sunny area or without shade, but at some point it needs to get back to the shade. Together with habitat destruction, there was also host elimination. The theory was that if we eliminate all the big game animals, the flies will have no food. However, the problem with that was that many of the tsetse flies feed on nocturnal animals, for example, bush pigs. And of course, these are, first of all, very difficult to find. And so this did not work at all. And of course, this is very ecologically insensitive and is no longer in use. Then from 1950s, basically after the Second World War, control is based on insecticides. So you can have insecticide spraying. We started with ground spraying and or aerial spraying. Nowadays, very few countries still do ground spraying. It's mainly aerial spraying. Then you can also do insecticide-treated animals, so-called mobile baits. This is a fairly cheap technique and is very effective because you put a pour on the animal, on your cows, your cattle, and you just let them graze freely, even inside tsetse habitat. And of course, tsetse flies are attracted to the cattle, the movement, the heat, the smell. And as they go to feed on the animal, they will get insecticide and be killed. Then we can also use insecticide-treated traps and targets. So if you look at this photograph on the left center, that is a target, we call them a target or a screen. It's basically blue and black cloth, which is impregnated with deltamethrin and then deployed at a certain density through the tsetse habitat. This particular picture, you can see the assistant there is pouring some chemical into a bottle. And if you look carefully at the bottom of a target, you can see some sachets hanging there. These are octanols and phenols, and the liquid in the bottle is acetone. So this represents the breath odor and the body odor of a cow. So it just increases the attractiveness of the target to lure more flies to it. And basically how it works, blood-feeding flies, but especially tsetse flies, are very attracted to that blue color, and especially the contrast between blue and black. And then they would fly towards the target and sit on it just for half a second. If their feet touch the target, they will pick up enough deltamethrin to be knocked down and killed eventually. So this is a fairly cheap technique, but it's rather labor intensive because you have to monitor your targets and traps and make sure that they're in good condition. Then we can also do sequential aerial treatment, which is basically the application of deltamethrin in a vaporized or ultra low volume spraying, really low volumes, 2.6 milligram per hectare. It's a very efficient method, but it's a fairly expensive method. Then the bottom picture, bottom right, This is from Tsetse colony in Onderstepoort. This is for the sterile insect technique. This involves the breeding and releasing of sterilized male flies. So the idea is you saturate the natural environment with sterile males, basically 10 sterile males to every one fertile male in nature. And then the sterile males will outcompete the fertile natural males, and the female will breed, will mate with a sterile male. And because tsetse flies mate only once, that female will have no viable offspring. This has been done successfully, but it's a very expensive technique, mainly because you need specialized laboratories or temperature-controlled facilities to breed the flies. You need to have a good blood source to feed them. And before you can do a sterile insect technique, you need to suppress the tsetse population with another method, one of these previous methods. So mostly we use insecticide-treated targets to suppress the population and then release the sterile males. Excuse me. Okay, so how did we make tsetse control cost efficient? So the project that I did with Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine was a combined project that we worked on 6 tsetse species in 6 African countries, and we investigated visual stimuli to improve the performance and the cost of targets. The idea was to get a low cost and low technology method of control. And so if you look at the photographs, the two on the bottom left, this was from 2007 to 2011. We did research and development. Basically what we did was to take the existing target. So again, this one where the two assistants are standing, that target is 1 meter by 1.5 meters. So we took that and tried to investigate how can we make it smaller, more cost efficient, and so on. And then we ended up with this tiny target, which is 8 times smaller and therefore at least 8 times cheaper. You use much less insecticide, much less material. It's easier to deploy, easier to maintain. So this is what we came up with through all this research and development. And then from 2012 until present, it's been implemented first in Uganda, which I'll explain a little bit later, but also currently a big project in DRC, in Guinea, and I think in Cote d'Ivoire as well. So just to explain these two photographs on the left bottom, this is actually, we call it an electric net. And basically what it is a metal frame with thin copper wires that runs positive, negative. It's almost like a mosquito zapper. So any fly or any insect which are attracted to the blue cloth will be killed immediately with the electric net and then fall into this tray at the bottom, so we can count them and see from on which side they came and all these sort of investigations. This is purely an experimental tool. Of course, you cannot do this in the field because each electric net works with a car battery and an inverter, and so it's purely an experimental setup, but very efficient to study the tsetse fly behavior and ecology. Okay, so let's talk about the example in West Nile in Uganda. So this is right up in the corner of Uganda, corner of South Sudan and DRC Congo. This is historically a Gambiense sleeping sickness area. And in 2011, when we started there, we had about 50 to 60 sleeping sickness cases per year. We established a research station in Arua town in 2011, and then conducted field surveys on tsetse presence, abundance, parasite infection rates, both in the flies and in cattle, to get an idea of the impact of the disease in that area. Then we recruited and trained local teams to deploy these tiny targets along the river systems. Basically, our guys had to go out in the field to walk along the river and deploy a target every 100 meters. So we trained them in GPS use, and they would just go and do this every day, day after day. By 2018, we covered an area of 7,500 square kilometers over 5 districts and deployed about 20,000 tiny targets every year. So these guys really did a huge job. We then handed it over to Uganda government's tsetse control unit. So this is now a completely self-sustained project and sleeping sickness control within country. The work we did here, so because of the effective vector control efforts in West Nile, combined with new drug development for treatment, achieved a reduction of 90% in tsetse populations, together with a 98% reduction in sleeping sickness cases. So by the time I left in 2018, there was only 2 sleeping sickness cases reported in West Nile. And both of these cases were actually refugees from South Sudan. So really in Uganda, in West Nile province in Uganda, we've completely controlled and eliminated sleeping sickness. Of course, because we controlled the tsetse fly populations, this also impacted on animal trypanosomosis. So the farmers, livestock keepers also had the benefit. This led to the World Health Organization declaration. This is the website link if you want to see that. In May this year, they declared Uganda, as well as Benin and Rwanda, free from human African trypanosomosis as a public health problem. So this means that despite there are still some flies, because we did not kill all the flies, this is almost impossible to kill all the flies and the parasites. So the flies and parasites are still present, but it is at sufficiently low levels, and we do have the technology and expertise to effectively manage Gambiense sleeping sickness from now on. So theoretically, there should never be an epidemic of Gambiense sleeping sickness in those areas. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, an interesting situation in South Africa with control versus conservation. So in South Africa, we only find tsetse flies in northeastern KwaZulu-Natal province, fairly small area, about 15,000 square kilometers with 200,000 cattle at risk. Only 2 species, Glossina austenai and Glossina brevipalpus, and this extends into Eswatini and southern Mozambique to create the southernmost distribution of tsetse flies on the continent. Earlier I mentioned about the temperature level, and if you look on this top map, you can see just below this, the red circle is the Umfolozi River, and this is basically the southernmost limit of tsetse flies. The reason is that below that level, the winter temperatures becomes too cold, and the pupa die in the soil. So there's no, the flies actually cannot exist there. So there's periodic outbreaks of Nagana in KwaZulu-Natal. The last serious one was in the 1990s, and this was controlled with deltamethrin dipping in the dip tanks. This bottom photograph, the map with the red areas surrounding the little black dots, all those little black dots are dip tanks, communal farming area dip tanks. So we went in, or veterinary services went in, and they made a deltamethrin dipping campaign where farmers would come in every 2 weeks and dip their cattle, and that controlled the situation. Currently, there's no structured control going on, so it now is the responsibility of individual livestock owners. Basically, in South Africa, although it's a national veterinary problem, national government says well, it's a provincial problem. The provincial government says, well, it's only in a part of our province, so it's actually a farmer's problem. So this is something that honest to put, the ARC is working on to get all these stakeholders involved and to get a more structured control program going. So of course, there's a big socio-economic impact on the farmers, because most of these farmers in KwaZulu-Natal are subsistence farmers. So if you have 10 cattle and 7 of them are infected with Nagana, you have a serious losses in your productivity. So as I said, it's a very small area in South Africa, only about 1.8% of South Africa's surface area. And in this area, there are many conservation areas, private and provincial game parks and reserves. And these act as islands because they are very well stocked with wildlife and very good vegetation still remaining. But of course, this is serves as a breeding habitat for tsetse flies and the parasites. And right on the fence line, on the other side of the fence, you have communal cattle farming areas. So the interesting situation we have in KwaZulu-Natal is that as in located in wildlife, their mandate is to protect all biodiversity, including tsetse flies and parasite, while as the Agricultural Research Council, our mandate is to improve livelihoods and production in line with the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. So this is a very interesting situation we have here. And we are in collaboration with our counterparts in Mozambique and Eswatini to tackle this problem and see how best we can find solutions for this. Okay, and that's basically it. So the take-home message, just remember that tsetse flies and trypanosomosis remain a serious constraint in Africa, but there's no need for complete eradication. Sustainable control is enough. Thank you.
So I would like to welcome everybody to ask questions now. Chris, I see a question from Sandra Hardy there. Sadly, I came in a little bit late, but are wild animals affected by Nagana?
Yes, thank you. If wild animals are within tsetse habitat, yes, they would most certainly or most likely have trypanosome parasites. And as I mentioned earlier, they are actually tolerant to Nagana. But if there are, for example, a drought or some other concurring disease, then Nagana will kick in as well, and the animal might die because of that, or at least become severely ill.
Okay. Thank you, Johan. Then Ali van Dalen, what is the possibility of tsetse resistance development to tethrin that is used for control?
Deltamethrin, yeah. Yes, that is good. That is a good question. Tsetse flies are actually incredibly susceptible to deltamethrin. And there's several studies going on potential resistance, but to date there's been no real resistance proven. Because, for example, like I said, the fly really need to touch that cloth, that impregnated cloth, for less than a second, and it picks up enough insecticide through its feet to be knocked down and die.
Dr. Llewellyn Taylor, if you can in the meantime unmute and please ask your question.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Johan, I just want to ask you a question. Tsetse fly was eradicated, as far as I know, some time ago from the Okavango Delta. Is that still the case? Is there not occasional outbreaks?
Yes, correct. It was controlled with aerial spraying very successfully. We do have some occasional reinvasion from neighboring Zambia and a small part of Namibia where the tsetse fly are present. But Botswana do regular control operations, and they also have what we call a target barrier. So these insecticide-treated screens or cloths, which then to minimize the risks of reinvasion. So it does still happen, but it is under a controlled situation.
Okay, thank you.
Johan, I just want to mention, I think John and Margaret Cooper wanted to ask a question. That's why they went into chat. I'm going to ask them to unmute.
I wanted to say how much I enjoyed the lecture, and without sounding too political, it was really very stimulating to think of all the work that went on trypanosomiasis, tsetse flies, in tropical diseases. Long before independence in many countries, we hear far too much negative stuff here in Britain about the colonials and forget the number of people who, in some cases, gave their lives in tropical medicine, etc. So I much enjoyed it and was delighted to hear that the speaker had been to Liverpool. I'm sorry it's cold and wet up there, but the people can be nice. I just wanted to ask the question about the prevalence of it, and I suppose it's a rhetorical question. When I first went to East Africa, to Tanzania, as a very raw 22-year-old veterinary officer, volunteer veterinary officer in 1966, the president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, said, when I became president, I realized that I only, in fact, ruled 1/3 of Tanganyika. The other 2/3 was ruled by the tsetse fly. And I wondered if the speaker thinks that's still true, or whether it was just a good political speech.
Thank you. No, indeed, I think that's very, very true to this day. Many or most of the African countries really struggle with tsetse fly. Not so much as a health problem, perhaps as in the past, but certainly as for livestock keepers, it is a really big challenge. I don't have much detail about Tanzania specifically, but I've worked in Kenya as well, and if you're in a tsetse area, then you struggle as a farmer. So
thank you very much. Thank you well. Asante sana.
Thank you, John. Just want to check you on this. I don't know if the question in the chat. How on earth do you sterilize a tsetse fly, and how long does it take per fly?
Okay, interesting question. Thank you.
Lovely question.
So we sterilize. So we sterilize them with X-ray or gamma radiation. So it's basically a radiation sterilization. We keep put about 100 flies in a small cage and put it through the sterilization equipment. And I haven't been involved with it myself, but some of my colleagues here do it as needed, and I don't think it takes that long, 2-3 hours maybe, and yeah, it's a fairly easy and fast process once you have the right equipment.
Thank you, Johan. And there's a question, and not a question, just a comment in the chat. The presentation reminded me of my early career days in as park biologist. Now it's jumping. Sorry, I'm losing it. Johan, if you can just catch it there. As park biologist in Mago National Park, southern Ethiopia. I had no good information about the fly then. Learned a lot today. Thank you very much. And it comes from Berhinun Gebremendin. Berhinun, if you want to come in and just make a comment about your work, it will also be interesting. If we can catch you, you will unmute you. Johan, can you find him?
Hi, my name is Barryun. I found this presentation very interesting because 25 years ago, I had no clue about the Tsetse fly, but I stayed there for over 1.5 years in the Mago National Park. And it's a very lowland area, and there are buffaloes and other wildlife species. But unfortunately, I wish I know all this during that time. But yeah, so that's why I just want to comment on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm currently joining you from Oslo.
Okay.
Thanks, Berryun. And you can carry it over to the youngsters now, all right?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Putting you back on mute.
Sorry, if I can just mention where Ethiopia has a very, very large Tsetse control unit and very active and very efficient. They have also quite a problem with Nagana, but they do really good work there.
Our friend Andy Klee, Johan. Hey, Andy, I'm not unmuting you to ask a question. It's actually to say hello to you. And by the way, you can ask a question. Good to see you again.
Hi, Chris. Johan, thanks very much for a fascinating presentation. I just wanted to touch on that whole friction between conservation and, looking after people and their livelihoods. Has any work been done on looking, if you're going in and doing an area and doing your Tsetse program, has anybody sort of been at the same time looking at the impact on the ecosystem, of what impact removing Tsetse fly? And I'm sorry, I didn't pick up if other insects are impacted as well. You know what I mean?
Yes, good question. First of all, one of the comments was also asking about if other insects are affected by delta methrin. So yes, of course, especially if it's aerial spraying, that do impact on other insects. But the examples from Botswana in the Okavango Delta, they did a big environmental impact assessment and found that there's no long-term effects on the other invertebrates. Then on your question, there's been studies done to find out which other insects or birds or any animal or organisms feed on tsetse fly, so which is reliant on tsetse fly. And really there seems to be very little, if any, that is reliant on tsetse fly. There's a few parasitoid insects which parasitize with the pupa, but this is negligible. So tsetse fly is really such a unique species. It sits basically by itself. If it has to be completely removed, so far data shows that it will probably not have a negative impact on the rest of the ecosystem. But having said that, it is very, very difficult to completely remove the tsetse fly. It's only been done once on an island in Zanzibar, outside of Zanzibar, and this was because it's an island. So there was no possibility of reinvasion. So it is very difficult. So that is why we nowadays don't talk much about eradication. It's more about control.
Chris, I just want to ask if you saw the question from Henny Butler. Why not tell people not to buy blue clothing? And then I would also like to add on to that, any other prevention methods that you would recommend if you know that you're going to visit a tsetse fly area?
Okay, yeah, that is a good question, and our staff as well, always when they have their blue overalls, we consider them as mobile baits. So but keep in mind, in Southern Africa, or South Africa at least, we don't have a human disease, so it's not really a problem. You do feel it when a tsetse fly bites you, though. It's quite painful. But you can use normal, similar repellents, DEET, and these things that works for mosquitoes will work to an extent to tsetse fly as well. But tsetse flies are extremely aggressive. Our guest earlier mentioned, Anthony mentioned as well that he got experience of tsetse fly bites. And really, there's not much you can do except cover yourself completely. But also, having said that, in my time up in West Africa, I got bitten many, many times. And you have to be really unlucky to be infected. We got regular screenings to make sure we're not infected. But it's calculated as something like 1 in 2,000 infected bites. One in 2,000 bites might be an infected bite. So you really have to be either unlucky to get bitten by that infected fly or expose yourself so often that you just increase your chances of getting infected.
Then Johan, is just a question by, looks like George Rocha. Can tsetse flies be exported overseas in cattle shipments? And thanks for the great talk, Johan.
Okay, thank you. Yes, theoretically, I'm sure they will be able to be exported. However, they'll probably not survive once they reach that side. Or if they do survive and they feed on a few blood meals, if there's only 1 or 2 flies, you know, the chances of establishing a viable population is basically negligible. I don't think that is a serious concern, really. And similar with, so for example, if the cattle are infected before shipment, so they come there with parasites in their blood, then again, unless there's a viable vector to transmit that parasite, it will not become a problem. And as I mentioned in the talk, tsetse flies are only cyclical vectors. So it means the parasite actually needs the tsetse fly's physiology to develop into the infective stage. So chances for that is really, really small.
Thank you, Johan. And then I think maybe just a comment from your side. You actually have referred to it, but I'm not going to ignore Peter Mills's comment in the chat. It is a conservation conundrum that we should conserve all biodiversity, including vectors and diseases, and in the same breath wish to develop and grow. Unfortunately, when the tsetse goes, the game soon follows. It's a strong statement. Johan, are you killing our game?
I'm not sure. It would be interesting to know what that is based on, that statement. I mean,
Peter Mills, you're still in. Peter Mills, you want to come in and make a comment? I'm unmuting you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Johan, for the talk. Well, look, it's common knowledge to say that the greatest conservationist in Africa is the tsetse fly, because that's where the game is and the cattle can't get in. And as soon as the area gets tons of tsetse flies, they, you know, the people move in and the game moves out. So it's you know, it's quite a common thinking. And so all the wild places that excuse me, all the wild places that are left in Africa are have tsetse fly in it. So that's why I said it's a conundrum, because you want development and want to, but there is the other side to it.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. No, that's correct. I did not keep that in mind. That's very true. That as tsetse fly is removed, you open up land for more people, and just the presence of people actually removes tsetse flies as well. But yeah, this is the conundrum we have. I don't have a straight answer for that.
Okay, it's your problem, Johan. We will always blame you for it. Okay. Llewellyn, is your hand up or is it still up? Okay, you okay? Must we unmute you?
Yeah, sorry. Just one more question, Johan, and yeah, I don't think we want to make this uncomfortable for you, but just coming back to the Okavango Delta, I haven't really done much reading on this for some time now, so I just wanted to ask you another question. Have you any idea what which insecticide is utilized in those control measures? And then in addition to that, I think there is information available on the impact on fish. Do you have any comments on that?
I think, as far as I know, it's deltamethrin, the insecticide. Either deltamethrin or endosulfan, but I think it's deltamethrin. And then on fish, not specifically. I don't know. I can't give you any data really, what the impact was. So no, sorry. I do know there was a very big environmental impact assessment, and some species was, what do you say, not eliminated but reduced. But as far as I understand, after some time they recovered back to normal population levels.
Yeah, I would assume that an EIA would obviously cover all of that, because the gills, the liver and so forth are definitely affected by those insecticides in fish.
Yes, for aquatic invertebrates as well, it is very, very susceptible. But because it's such an ultra low volume spray.
Yeah, okay.
It's
I can add to that. Can you hear me? I can add to that.
Please, Anthony, come in. Yes.
Yeah, the last question is very relevant. I was friendly quite some years ago with a young American ichthyologist who was studying fish in the Okavango. And at that time they were spraying with endosulfan, and it had a pretty serious effect on the fish in the Okavango at that time. It may well be that since then the dilution and all the rest of it has taken its toll, and so there's very little traces. I'm not sure what the half-life, or whatever you like to call it, of endosulfan is, but most definitely, according to Glenn, it was not a nice impact that it had on the fish. But I also want to say, Johan, thank you for a very interesting chat there. And when I mentioned being stung as a youngster or bitten by a tsetse fly, in those days, there was no doubt that tsetse fly kept the cattle out of quite large areas of Zimbabwe, where I was resident at that time. But thank you again, and thanks everybody else to listen to your comments and things. It's been a great experience.
Thank you, Anthony, and thanks for joining us. Johan, I think there was in the chat a question about climate change and how that would affect, let me just try and get back into the chat, how that would affect the tsetses, and will they become more or less or in different areas? I cannot find it now.
Yeah, but I can just on that as a general question. Yes, if climate change results in more tropical type of habitat recovering, then certainly the fly could potentially increase its distribution. So, for example, in South Africa, we had originally four tsetse species. One was up in Kruger Park, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga area, and severely restricted the early cattle farmers there until the rinderpest epidemic of 1899 to 1901, where majority of the wildlife actually died out, and the cattle with it, to such an extent that the tsetse fly died out as well. And to this day, tsetse flies have not returned because of it. I mean, there's no control going on there. And that was purely because of the rinderpest epidemic. So that habitat is certainly already good for the tsetse fly. We are actually initiating a study just now with Mozambique to look at the transboundary area between Kruger and Mozambique to see if there are actually tsetse flies moving across, or if we can find parasites in the game animals.
Thank you, Claudia. I trust that your question has been answered, although I didn't read it exactly as you wrote it. I hope it's okay, Claudia. If not, just raise your hand and jump in. All right. Johan Kruger.
Chris, I see there's another question by Vaughan Swart. I think the audience would like to know about potential other diphtheria vectors. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay. Really, the only alternative vectors would be vectors with large mouth parts, like the Tabanidae, the horseflies, because the bite is so painful that if Tabanidae, the horsefly, bites an infected cow and there remains some blood on the mouth part, and then it transfers it directly to another animal, which it then bites, then it might transfer the parasite. But like I mentioned, the parasites actually need the tsetse fly's physiology to complete its development stage. So, you know, unless there's another cyclical vector, and to date that has not been found. So it is a very unique link between tsetse flies and trypanosome parasites for Nagana and human sleeping sickness. However, the Tabanidae do transmit Sura, which is Nagana for camels, and that is a straightforward mechanical transmission. Horseflies and Stomachus, the stable flies, they do transmit that. But that's not the same Nagana as we are discussing here. That is also not economically or socio-economically such a big impact.
Okay, Johan, thank you for that answer. Any further questions from the chat or from the room? Please feel welcome to raise your. So there's a question from Ali van Dalen. Sorry, back to resistance. In the northern KZN, the treatment of cattle with deltamethrin unintentionally caused resistance development of ticks that also carry pathogens causing disease to cattle of subsistence farmers. Are this taken into account with the treatment programs at dip tanks?
Yes, good question. Thank you. Yes, so during that early 1990s outbreak, prior to that, that whole network of dip tanks was actually against the ticks. So it was with an acaricide dip tank or dipping fluid. But then when that Nagana outbreak occurred, they stopped the acaricide and brought in the deltamethrin for about 2 years. And then they reverted back to acaricide because the ticks do pick up resistance against the deltamethrin. So it's, yeah, so the veterinary services that take that into account. And I think there's still currently dipping going on against ticks. But because there's no Nagana outbreak, so we don't use deltamethrin anymore.
Sure. John Atkins, please unmute and ask your question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Johan, I just wanted to say what a fantastic talk that was. And secondly, that you are clearly involved in massively important research. And I have two things that I wanted to comment. One, I was regularly, I lived in Malawi for 9 years in the 1980s, and the first 3 of those were in northern Malawi. And I used to make regular visits with a Catholic brother to Voisa Marsh, which is up in the north of Malawi, west of Rumpi. It was an absolutely beautiful area, but totally infested with tsetse flies. And he actually caught, I can't remember how to pronounce it now, but he caught it and had to be freighted back to Germany for treatment. His temperature apparently went off the Richter scale. So had a very, very sad time. Okay, my main point is, do you envisage a time when the tsetse fly and the dangers of the tsetse fly will be possible to eradicate across Africa as a whole?
Yes, thank you. So yes, I think if we have to make the distinction between the human disease, so sleeping sickness or human African trypanosomiasis, and animal trypanosomiasis. So for human sleeping sickness, I think certainly it is possible because there's been a very big development of drugs as well. So now there's easy administrable drugs available. Even the smallest little clinic can keep these drugs. So for the human part, even if there's still tsetse flies around, I think for the human part in the foreseeable future, that will be possible. In fact, WHO put 2030 as their, so this is 8 years from now, put as their goal to eliminate sleeping sickness as a public health concern. If we speak about animal trypanosomiasis or Nagana, that is a different story. Sorry, can you hear? Nagana, the animal disease, is a different story because it's just vast areas that needs to be treated or controlled. So I'm not sure how quickly or how feasible that really is. There's already drugs available that the individual farmer can use to treat these animals. But yeah, that is a huge challenge, is the animal trypanosomiasis.
Prof. Lieselfinus, I saw your hand went up and then you disappeared from my screen completely. I'm trying to find you.
If I'm going to speak, my dog will probably start barking. I want to connect to the comment that Peter Mills made about if we eradicate the tsetses, what is the implication for conservation-wise for animals. The same applies with what's going to happen if we eradicate ticks, because they're also carrying over the diseases. So the whole impact of what we are doing, we're focusing on human diseases / game. So what is the way forward into controlling the diseases that we are challenging with?
Sorry, is that a general question or is it specifically to me? I don't know the answer for that.
No, it's to you because you've been dealing with this. You've been you have an understanding of the way forward. You have experience with it. So connected to climate changes, what is the way forward?
Yeah, no, it's difficult. It's the balance between almost, you know, what is the intrinsic value of a human life or a tick's life or a fly's life. It's a difficult situation to really answer. I don't know. Yeah, sorry. No, I can't. I don't know. Yeah.
Johan, I don't blame you. You need collective wisdom to answer that question. If cattle were injected with ivermectin, would that prevent Nagana? A question from Sandra Hardy.
Well, okay, I'm not that knowledgeable about ivermectin, but if it will kill the parasite in the blood system of a cow, of a cattle, then yeah, for sure it will not prevent Nagana because the cow will become infected again if it's in the tsetse area. But you can, if ivermectin will kill the parasite, you can save your animal. Yes.
Dr. Llewellyn Taylor raised his hand. Please go ahead and unmute.
Sorry, Johan. I just want to ask another question. Do trypanosoma species have a sexual phase, or do some species have a sexual phase in the tsetse fly, or is it entirely asexual?
No, as far as I know, it's all asexual. So the fly injects the parasite, and then it develops from the midgut. It starts to multiply, and then eventually move into the salivary gland of the fly, and eventually into the proboscis, which is then the infective stage.
Yeah, so for Gambians, for example, it would be asexual, entirely asexual.
Yeah, as far as I understand. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Johan, thank you very, very much for fielding a whole lot of interesting questions tonight. And conveying a lot of information on a topic that we needed to be enlightened on.
Sorry, I didn't see I was muted. Yes, thank you. No, it was very interesting. Some challenging questions and interesting things to follow up on. So thank you for that for everyone.
And thank you to everybody that joined us from Ethiopia to the UK, all over. It's wonderful to have you with us. We look forward to having you with us next week again, when Johan Bauer will be talking to us about farming and conservation. And